Hi, and welcome to the latest lecture. This one's going to be on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And we're going to start by talking about the structure of the spinal cord itself. Spinal cord, of course, starts at just below the base of the brainstem. It is contiguous with the brainstem. And the spinal cord extends about 42 to 45 centimeters down through the vertebral column from the base of the brain to the top of the L1 vertebra. Now, for those of you who are thinking, but the spine goes all the way down to the coccyx, the true spinal cord only goes as far as the lumbar vertebra. The rest of it is actually a collection of nerves. You can see on this diagram that it stops right about here and then starts branching into individual nerves. The sections of the spinal cord are named for the areas where the nerves exit. So the cervical nerves exit from the cervical vertebrae in general. The thoracic nerves exit from the thoracic vertebra in general. The lumbar nerves are going to exit from the lumbar vertebrae, even though they leave the spinal cord itself way up here at the bottom of the thoracic vertebrae. And then when it gets to the bottom of the thoracic section of the vertebral column, the true spinal cord narrows into what we call the conus medullaris, which means the cone in the middle. So you remember we had medulla in other parts. We have a cortex and a medulla in several parts of the body. Medullaris means the middle, medulla. So the conus medullaris is the middle cone. And you can see it right here where the true spinal cord narrows into this cone-shaped structure right there. And then at the bottom, what we have are individual nerves that have exited from the spinal cord. They're going to continue to travel down through the vertebral foramina through this pathway. But they're just a collection of nerves, not the spinal cord, which has a different structure. And together we call those the cauda equina. And in the middle of them is something called the filum terminale. And that filum terminale is a little layer, a strand of pia mater. And you remember the pia mater is the meningeal layer that sits on the brain. We're going to have that same layer on the spinal cord. So it keeps extending beyond the end of the spinal cord, and it goes all the way down to the coccyx, and it anchors the spinal cord in that vertebral column, and it helps it to stay there and not sort of inch up when you curve your back. So the cauda equina is all of these together. Cauda equina means horsetail, and so this ponytail is going down through those vertebral foramina, that channel, with the filum terminale in the middle. When we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we see white matter and gray matter, gray matter, and we see that there are two divisions, an anterior and a posterior divisions, or anterior and posterior sides, that are both divided in the middle. The posterior median sulcus is deep, and the anterior median fissure is shallow, which makes no sense. The fissure should be deep and the sulcus should be shallow, but I don't know why they named it like this, but they did. So just remember that it's not the way it's supposed to be, because it's the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is wackadoodle. Everything's backward. The sulcus is deep. The white matter is on the outside. Everything's wrong. Everything's backwards. Anyway. The gray matter in the spinal cord is divided into horns. On the posterior side, we have a posterior horn. On the lateral horn is only found in the thoracic part of the spinal cord. And then in the anterior portion, we have the anterior horn. The anterior horn is going to hold the cell bodies of somatic neurons. The posterior horn is going to have unmyelinated axons of sensory neurons, and then cell bodies of interneurons. Okay, remember that the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are outside of the spinal cord in the posterior root ganglion. And then the lateral horns are going to have cell bodies for autonomic motor neurons. The gray commissure is this little strip of gray matter that connects the right and left sides. You remember a commissure is a set of tracts that crosses across the median of the central nervous system. In the middle of the gray commissure is the central canal. That's connected to the ventricles of the brain, and it is full of cerebrospinal fluid. And then as we look at the different cross sections as we move down through the spinal cord, you see that the organization of white matter to dark matter changes. In the cervical part, we have tons and tons of white matter. Much less of the space is taken up with the gray matter. When we get down to the lumbar and sacral regions, more of the space is taken up by the gray matter, but the spinal cord is narrower as a whole. So there's less white matter around. And that makes sense because the sacral portion of the spinal cord, for example, only needs to carry signals from the bottom of the body up to the brain and then back down from the brain. Whereas the cervical portion of the spinal cord needs to carry all the signals from the trunk, from the arms and the legs, everything that is going up to the brain and from the brain down to the body. So those myelinated axons that make up the white matter are going to be much more numerous in the cervical part because the cervical part has to carry all of that information going up and down. So all of this out here is those myelinated axons passing up and down through the spinal cord. Now the white matter is further divided into funiculi. And funiculus is just a name we give for a portion of the white matter. So we have a posterior funiculus, a lateral funiculus, and an anterior funiculus on each side of the spinal cord, and then a white commissure connecting the two sides just deep to that anterior fissure. Okay. Within the funiculi, we have many, many tracts carrying either sensory or motor signals up or down through the spinal cord. Now, the meninges around the spinal cord are going to be the same layers that we see around the brain. The only difference is that we have what had been a potential space is now a real space, and that's this epidural space here. The epidural space sits between the periosteum of the vertebra, which is here, and the dura mater. The dura mater here is just one layer. And this is where they give an epidural shot, which you have undoubtedly heard of from someone who was pregnant and got an epidural. And what they do is they have the patient flex their spine, bend forward as far as they can, which frankly, when you've got a giant parasite in your abdomen, is not very far. And you bend forward as far as you can so that the spinous processes of these lumbar vertebrae separate as much as possible. And then they look for the space between, I don't remember if it's L3 and 4 or 4 and 5. So they feel along those spinous processes, they feel the space between them, and then they stick a giant needle through that space, through the intervertebral disc, into this tiny little space right here, and that is where they make the injection. And then because of that injection, it will then numb everything from the site of the injection down. So that way the woman won't feel any more pain from the contractions. The dura mater comes next. So we've got the epidural space and then the dura mater there. And notice that the dura mater extends beyond the spinal cord. So it protects the spinal cord, but it also protects the spinal nerves as they exit through these intervertebral foramina on either side. Then deep to that, we have an arachnoid matter layer and the subarachnoid space here, and that space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This is where a doctor is going to do a lumbar puncture. And the lumbar puncture, they're going to do the same thing as they did with the epidural, where they try to get these spinous processes separated as much as possible. And they take a big long needle and they push it through all of that, through the intervertebral disc, past the epidural space, past the dura mater, into that teensy, tiny, itsy bitsy little subarachnoid space to take out a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. And the reason you would do this is if you suspected that someone had an infection of the central nervous system. The waste from immune cells cleaning up that infection, that waste is going to get transported into the cerebrospinal fluid. And so you will see the evidence of that infection as cloudy material in the cerebrospinal fluid. Normally, the cerebrospinal fluid is completely clear, it just looks like water. So if it comes out cloudy, then that means someone has an infection and their immune system is trying to fight off that infection within the central nervous system. Not an infection just anywhere, but an infection in the central nervous system. Now, one thing I love is that on like movies and TV shows, they have to do a lumbar puncture and they just sort of do it on somebody sitting up and then the patient walks away 5 minutes later. That's not how it happens, because in order to do the lumbar puncture, they've made a hole in your dura mater and they really want to make sure that that hole closes up when they remove the needle. And so they're going to put you on your side to do this so you can curl up into a ball on your side. And then you're not going to move for at least 15 minutes after the lumbar puncture, sometimes longer, so that they can make sure that hole closes up and you don't start leaking cerebrospinal fluid into the epidural space, because that would be bad. One other thing to note is that the site of where they do either an epidural or a lumbar puncture is below the end of the true spinal cord. So it is where the cauda equina sits. So even if the needle goes too far and punctures a nerve, it's probably only going to damage a single nerve and not that very dense neural tissue of the true spinal cord. So it's a little safer than trying to inject something around the true spinal cord. Still pretty impressive. All right, so here's all those layers, the dura mater out here extending out around the spinal nerve, the subdural space, still a potential space, the arachnoid space, and then below that the subarachnoid space filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pia mater attached to the surface of the spinal cord, okay? And then within that, the white matter and the gray matter. Now notice that as the spinal nerve gets to the spine, the spinal cord, it branches off into different pieces like that. So let's talk about those. These little ones, these little branches closest to the spinal cord are called rootlets, meaning little roots, and then they're going to fuse together to form roots. The ones on the posterior side are called the posterior roots, and the ones on the anterior side are called anterior roots. The anterior rootlets emerge from the spinal cord, merge into an anterior root. These are going to contain motor neurons, the axons of motor neurons. The posterior side, we have the root ganglion, and then the group of neurons carrying sensory information emerges into the root, which then branches into these posterior rootlets that then enter into the posterior side of the spinal cord. The anterior root and the posterior root merge after the intervertebral foramen, past the posterior root ganglion. They're going to merge into a spinal nerve, okay? And then that spinal nerve is then going to start branching again. And those branches are, of course, going to have their own names because, of course, they do. The way you're going to remember this, that the sensory arrives on the posterior side, the motor exits on the anterior side, is this mnemonic same Dave. So we have sensory afferent, motor efferent, dorsal arriving, ventral exiting. Okay, and in this diagram we actually have the somatic sensory neurons and the visceral sensory neurons, which you can see are going to synapse in different sections of this posterior horn. And then the autonomic motor neurons and the somatic motor neurons, again, are going to synapse in different portions of the anterior horn. And so that's what this is, the 4 different types of neurons, but still sensory is posterior, motor is anterior. All right, now, right after emerging, the spinal nerve is going to branch into rami, singular ramus. The posterior ramus is much, much smaller than the anterior. This is the anterior, this is the posterior. The posterior ramus is going to head posteriorly and innervate the muscles of the back, especially those deep muscles, and the skin of the back. Okay, so all of those deep muscles of the back, especially those erector muscles, those postular muscles that we learned, and the quadratus lumbar and all those muscles, these are going to be innervated by this posterior ramus on both sides, one there and one there. And then the anterior ramus is much, much larger. It's going to immediately start branching as well to innervate the anterior and lateral portion of the trunk, the upper limbs, the lower limbs, all those things are going to branch off of this anterior ramus. Now we do have one more branch here, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now the other thing to remember is that the spinal nerve and the rami carry motor and sensory information. Okay, so if you think about it, this nerve coming from the arm, it's carrying sensory information from the arm and motor information to the arm. That's all going to go through one pathway, and then just before it gets to the spinal cord, they're going to split into sensory and motor. Okay, think of it as traffic going in 2 directions on the freeway, which is the nerve, and then the different on-ramps and off-ramps, each going in only one direction. That's kind of a good way to think of it. All right, so the other branch that we see is this little one here, the rami communicantes. And at the bottom, or at the end of the rami communicantes, there's this little ganglion called the sympathetic trunk ganglion. And this is going to be associated with the autonomic nervous system, especially the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. These are going to extend from this anterior ramus out to this ganglion and back. But they're also then, these different ganglia are going to connect up and down the vertebral column to carry signals and integrate signals to different parts of the trunk of the body, in particular the internal organs. So let's talk for a moment about this sympathetic division and its counterpart, the parasympathetic division. So the sympathetic division is your fight or flight division. This is your stress response. And it's going to send signals to the internal organs that give blood to the heart, speed the beating of the heart, speed respiration rate, and decrease the amount of blood to the digestive system so that you can run away from danger or hide or fight. Those are your fight or flight responses. The counterpart to that is the rest and digest response, which is in control when you are resting. It's going to slow your heart, slow your breathing, put less blood to your skeletal muscles, and more blood to your digestive system. Now, these rarely is one of these completely in control. Most of the time, they're kind of doing a balancing act between the two of them, or I like to think of it as a tug of war that neither one really ever wins. So if you think about when you're, chilling, binge watching some TV show, and then there's a scary scene, and you're like, what's going to happen? When you're binge watching and you're chilling, the rest and digest, the parasympathetic division is in control. As you start getting nervous, thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to this character? Then the fight or flight, the sympathetic division, starts taking a little more control, but just a little bit, right? And then, everything's fine, crisis averted, you go back to the rest and digest. Then you got to get up to refill your snacks. You get a little more emphasis on the fight or flight just because you need to get the muscles moving. Right? You need a little more blood to the skeletal muscles. Then you can go back to the rest and digest. You can just go back to chilling on the couch. Okay? So they're constantly working in opposition to each other. The sympathetic division, that innervation comes from this sympathetic trunk. The parasympathetic division, that innervation comes from the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve has got to be the main signaling site for that parasympathetic division. All right. Now, from the anterior ramus along the thoracic portion of the spinal cord, we have the intercostal nerves. Okay, so the anterior ramus becomes the intercostal nerve, goes around in that costal groove on the rib, and then branches off to innervate the intercostal muscles to receive sensations from the chest. Okay. Because of the branching of the spinal nerves and the way the spinal nerves exit the spinal cord, we have these things called dermatomes, which are specific segments of skin that get innervated by a certain part of the spinal cord. This is one of the ways that we isolate the site of a spinal nerve injury. If someone can feel, everything down to their belly button, then we know that the injury is at that T10 spinal nerve. It also can cause some funny effects sometimes in what we call referred visceral pain, which is that pain from one organ is felt somewhere else on the body. So one of the classic ones is that pain from a heart attack is sometimes felt down the left arm, and that's because of this T1 innervation here that goes down the arm, this T1 and this little bit of this T2 that go down this side of the arm. Another one is pain from an appendicitis is sometimes felt in the belly button. And it's really just the brain misunderstanding the sensory signals that it's receiving. Having never received pain signals from that area before, it might try to associate the pain with something it has felt before. So that's one of the things that can happen with referred visceral pain. Let's see, another fun thing with dermatomes is that shingles. Shingles reinfects along the posterior root ganglion, or the sympathetic root ganglion, because the chickenpox virus hasn't been destroyed in your body. If you had chickenpox when you were a kid, it's still in your body. You can't kill it. You can just bitch slap it into submission, and your immune system has bitch slapped it into submission, and it hid in your body, and it hid along these ganglia. So one of the really common symptoms of shingles is a rash that develops on the back. Now, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the rash develops in other places. It could develop anywhere on the body, but having a rash on the back is a really classic symptom of a shingles infection. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to start another section on the nerve plexuses.